Richard III did not survive in history. He survived on stage. By the time Shakespeare wrote his name, the battle was already over. The records were thin, the witnesses were gone, and the silence was complete. Shakespeare did not need to prove anything. He only needed to give shape to what power had already prepared. A body, a voice, a villain. Once Richard III stepped onto the stage, he never left it. Because when a story is performed often enough, it stops being remembered as a story and starts being believed as history. This episode is not about what Shakespeare invented. It is about why his version was allowed to become permanent. By the time Shakespeare began to write, the danger was already gone. The Tudors were secure. The throne was no longer contested, and the past no longer fought back. Richard III had been dead for over a century. There were no living Yorkist claimants who could challenge the story. No political cost to how he was portrayed. This mattered because power does not risk itself on the stage. It waits until the outcome is safe. The groundwork had already been laid. Henry VII had narrowed the record. Henry VIII had reinforced it through law, and Elizabeth I ruled over a version of history that no longer needed defending. Richard III existed now only as memory. And memory, without protection, is vulnerable. There was no authorized defense of Richard, no official account of his reign that demanded respect. The gaps were obvious, but the silence was louder. This made Richard III the perfect subject. He was close enough in time to feel real, but distant enough to be reshaped. He had ruled during a period already framed as chaos. Civil war, unstable crowns, broken succession. The stage did not need a complex king. It needed a final one, a figure who could carry the moral weight of an entire violent century, and Richard III fit the role. Not because he was proven guilty, but because no one remained to insist on nuance. Shakespeare did not step into a debate. He stepped into a vacuum, a space where power had already decided what kind of story would be acceptable. The past had been cleared. The risks had been removed, and the audience was ready. All that remained was to give the silence a voice. And once that voice spoke, it would be heard far longer than any surviving record. The Elizabethan stage did not reward complexity. It demanded clarity. Audiences did not come to the theater to weigh evidence. They came to recognize meaning, order, disorder, good, and evil. History, on stage, had to be legible, and that meant someone had to carry the blame. Richard III was uniquely suited to the role. He was the last king of a violent age, the final ruler before Tudor order began, and he had no political descendants who could challenge the story. Most importantly, he could not answer back. The stage required a villain, not because Richard was proven guilty, but because the narrative required resolution. Civil war needed an ending. Chaos needed a face. And Richard provided both. Shakespeare inherited a past that had already been framed. Richard's reign was short, his record incomplete, his reputation undefended. That absence created freedom. Not the freedom to invent anything, but the freedom to select, to compress years into moments, to gather scattered accusations into a single character. On stage, ambiguity is dangerous. A morally uncertain king creates confusion, not drama. So Richard's complexity was simplified. His political actions became personal ambition. Structural violence became individual cruelty. And physical difference became moral signal. The crooked body told the audience what to think before the character even spoke. This was not subtle. It was theatrical. Elizabethan drama relied on visual shorthand. Evil had to be seen, as well as heard. Richard's deformity was not medical history. It was moral language. Once that language was established, everything else followed. His crimes multiplied, his motives darkened, and his downfall became inevitable. The villain does not fall because he is defeated. He falls because the story demands it. Richard III did not need to be accurate. He needed to be useful. A warning, a conclusion, a necessary contrast. Because in order for Tudor stability to feel natural, what came before it had to feel monstrous. This is why Richard had to be a villain. Not because Shakespeare hated him, not because the evidence was clear, but because the stage required a figure who could absorb the sins of an entire century. And Richard was close enough and silent enough to do the job. Ambiguity does not survive the stage. Theater demands form. What is uncertain must be made visible. What is complex must be simplified. What is unresolved must be embodied. Richard III did not arrive on Shakespeare's stage as a historical problem. He arrived as an image. The first transformation was physical. Shakespeare gave Richard a body that could be read at a glance, a crooked back, a twisted form, a figure that looked wrong. Before it spoke, this was not medical description. It was moral shorthand. Elizabethan audiences were trained to read bodies as signs of inner truth. Deformity did not suggest illness. It suggested corruption. Before Richard committed a single crime, his appearance had already convicted him. The second transformation was psychological. Shakespeare gave Richard a voice that history never recorded. Through soliloquy, the audience was invited inside his mind, not to understand him, but to witness intention. Ambition became personal. Calculation became pleasure. Violence became choice. Complex political struggles were reduced to individual desire. Power was no longer structural. It was psychological. The third transformation was narrative. Events were rearranged. Timelines were compressed. Motives were clarified. Accusations that had once floated as rumors were gathered, organized, and assigned. Not because the evidence demanded it, but because drama required coherence. In Shakespeare's hands, uncertainty became inevitability. Each step led cleanly to the next. Each crime prepared the audience for the fall. By the time Richard collapsed, the question was no longer whether he was guilty, it was whether he deserved anything else. This is how ambiguity disappears, not through argument, but through repetition. Each performance reinforced the image. Each revival sharpened it. Over time, the character replaced the king. Richard III ceased to be a contested historical figure. He became a face, a voice, and a role, passed from actor to actor, And once history acquires an image, it becomes almost impossible to recover what came before it. Because images do not ask questions, they answer them. Once the image was complete, the audience took over. Theater does not persuade by evidence. It persuades by repetition. Each performance reinforced the same shape, the same gestures, the same moral conclusion, and over time, recognition replaced analysis. Richard III became familiar, predictable, certain. The audience no longer asked whether he was guilty, they asked how he would fall. This is how cultural memory forms, not through archives, but through expectation. When a story is told often enough, it stops feeling like interpretation and begins to feel like truth. The stage trained the audience how to remember, and once trained, they carried that memory with them, out of the theater, into conversation, into print. Richard III moved from performance to common knowledge. Later historians did not begin with the records. They began with the image. Even when documents contradicted the play, they were read through it. Evidence became secondary. Explanation became unnecessary. The character had already answered the question. This is the final transformation. Power no longer needs to control the past directly. It allows culture to do the work for it. The audience does not feel manipulated. They feel informed. They believe they have seen the truth. But what they have seen is a performance, repeated until it hardened into memory. This is why the Tudor myth survived, not because it was enforced, but because it was enjoyed. By the time anyone returned to the archives, the image was already too strong. Richard III was no longer a king to be investigated. He was a villain to be recognized. And once an audience accepts a villain, it rarely asks what else might have been possible. Once the audience accepted the image, the story no longer needed proof. The villain had a face, a voice, and a fate everyone recognized. Richard III was no longer remembered as a king with a disputed record. He was remembered as a character. And characters do not argue back. This is the danger of stories that feel complete. They close questions before they are ever asked. But the archives did not disappear. They were simply ignored. Because when history is inherited through theater, evidence becomes inconvenient. In the next episode, we leave the stage. We return to the records, not to defend Richard III, not to rehabilitate him, but to ask a question the Tudor myth never wanted asked. What happens when the documents are allowed to speak for themselves?